We're going to talk about world history. We're going to talk about World War II. We're going to talk about the Nazis. We're going to talk about cartels and industry and that sort of thing. It is absolutely essential to have this information to understand who are they. Now, the information that follows is taken primarily from government hearings. Most of them are right there in the library today. Hearings that took place between the years 1928 and 1946. Hearings on such subjects as Nazi propaganda, the munitions industry, cartels, national defense, patents, lobbies, banking and currency, and especially the court records from the Nurenberg trials. So what I'm saying is that the information is not widely known, and yet there's nothing mysterious about it. It is simply a matter of the public record for anyone to read if they want to simply take the time to dig it out. And this is the story. There came into being, shortly after World War I, in Germany, a cartel. It was known then and is still known today as I.G. Farben. I.G. Farben. I.G. stands for Interessengemeinschaft, which I'm told in German means community of interest, or, in plain English, a grouping or a cartel. Interessengemeinschaft, community of interest, community of corporate interest, a cartel. Farben is the German word for dyes or dyestuffs. It is only of historical interest because when the cartel first came into being, it was a grouping of chemical companies that did one thing, and that was to make dyestuffs. But that has long since ceased to be its primary identity. It has grown and expanded so that through the years it has become a cartel of all forms of commercial chemicals, including munitions and drugs. I.G. Farben. It's necessary to define a cartel very briefly. A cartel simply is what you might call an international monopoly. It is a monopoly that crosses national boundaries. It is a grouping of corporate interests that come together and by contract agree with each other not to compete in various areas where they might otherwise compete. Now, at one end of the spectrum, the least harmful of these contracts, these cartel agreements, would be something on patents and agreements where they would standardize their tools. And everybody get the same size nut and bolt. Something like this would be very harmless. And that would be a cartel agreement. They would agree not to compete on standards like that. You would say generally that that was a very advantageous thing. But most of the cartel agreements are not innocuous like that. Most of them deal with forms of competition that would otherwise result in reducing a price. They agree not to compete on price. They agree, for instance, not to compete in markets, geographical markets. They'll say, well, you can have South America, I get North America, and this guy over here gets Asia, and so forth. They agree not to compete on product. You can produce all of this kind of a drug, the anesthetics, and we'll stay with the antibiotics. Or you produce tractors, we'll produce automobiles. You produce military equipment, we produce equipment for peacetime use. So we don't get in each other's way. And by layering these agreements, one on top of each other, gradually these corporate entities, which are competitors, come closer and closer together. And the areas of competition become narrower and narrower until finally the end of this process is a conglomerate of giant corporations which for all practical purposes are one. And the economy of the world has been moving in that direction for many, many years. So these are the cartels. Now the I.G. Farben cartel, or just commonly called I.G., existed in 93 countries on all continents. And we know a lot of information about I.G. because at the end of World War II, the Allied forces moved in and took over the building, which was the headquarters of I.G. Farben. It was intact. And although many of the files had been destroyed, many of them were not, and the records were there. And so we know that they existed in 93 countries on all continents, and if you were to just read a list of the corporations in this world that had interlocking cartel agreements with IG, it would take you hours just to read the names, one after the other. There were, in fact, over 2,000 companies. IG dominated all of German industry. It dominated most of European industry, and it dominated much of the industry in the United States of America. I'd like to read to you a very partial list of those firms in the United States which were part of the IG Farben interlock. They include Abbott Laboratories, Alcoa, Anaconda, Atlantic Oil, Bell & Howell, the Borden Company, the Carnation Company, Dow Chemical, DuPont, Eastman Kodak, Firestone Rubber, Ford Motor, General Drug Company, General Electric, General Mills, General Motors, General Tire, Glidden Paint, Goodyear Rubber, Gulf Oil, the Kellogg Company, Monsanto Chemical, National Lead, Nestle's, Owl Drug Company, Park Davison Company, Pet Milk, Pittsburgh Glass, Procter & Gamble, Pure Oil, Remington Arms, Richfield Oil, Shell Oil, Saucony Oil, Standard Oil, Texaco, Union Oil, U.S. Rubber, and hundreds more. Now those are ones that just had, better known ones, that just had interlocking cartel agreements of one kind or another. That's not too bad, you might think. Those companies which were owned outright by IG Farben, totally owned, or companies in which the controlling interest was held. Here are some of the companies that fall into that category. The Bayer Company. By the way, Professor Bayer was one of the founders of IG Farben. The Bayer Company, Lederle Laboratories, American IG Chemical Corporation, Sterling Drug Company, Winthrop Chemical, Metz Laboratories, Hoffman LaRoche Laboratories, the J.T. Baker Chemical Company, Whitehall Laboratories, Frederick Stearns and Company, the Nyall Company, Dern and Mitchell Laboratories, Chef Boyardee, Breck Incorporated, Hayden Antibiotics, McGregor Instrument Company, Antrol Laboratories, Cardinal Laboratories, Van Ness Laboratories, the William S. Merrill Company, Jensen Salisbury Laboratories, Lesser Laboratories, Taylor Chemical, the Ozolid Corporation, Alba Pharmaceutical, Bristol Myers, Drug Incorporated, Vegex Incorporated, Squibb and Sons Pharmaceutical, and scores of others. I repeat, these were companies which were totally owned or controlled completely by IG Farben. Now, after World War I, the defeat of Germany in World War I, the German industrialists were very concerned over the fact that they did not have an independent source of petroleum inside Germany. They felt, perhaps rightly, that one of the reasons they lost World War I was because they literally ran out of gas. And so they set the top chemists at Farben, IG Farben, to work. The task was to figure out a way to produce gasoline out of something that was in abundance inside Germany. And of course, there's plenty of coal inside Germany. And they did. They finally perfected something which was known then as the hydrogenation process. After this was perfected, they sent an invitation to the United States, to Standard Oil of New Jersey, the Rockefeller empire, and they invited Standard to send over to the Baldisch plant in Germany, Farben's Baldisch plant, someone to come see what they had done, an inspector, an observer. And they sent a man by the name of Frank Howard, who was vice president of Standard Oil and in charge of all overseas operations. And Frank Howard went over there probably somewhat skeptically about what he was going to find. And they toured him around the plant, showed him their hydrogenation process, and Howard ran back to his hotel and sent a letter to Mr. Walter Teagle, who was the president of Standard Oil. And here, in part, is what that letter said. This was March of 1926. Based upon my observations and discussions today, I think that this matter is the most important which has ever faced our company. The Baldisch can make high-grade motor oil fuel from lignite and other low-quality coals in amounts up to 1/2 the weight of the coal. This means absolutely the independence of Europe on the matter of gasoline supply. Straight price competition is all that is left. And you could almost see the tears streaming down his cheek as he thought about price competition. Good heavens, this is not what monopolists want. Price competition is the last thing they want. So that's why he was concerned. Straight price competition is all that is left, fellas. We've got to do something. He said, I shall not attempt to cover any details, but I think this will be evidence of my state of mind. That was March of 1926. You might keep that in mind the next time somebody is giving you the propaganda about a gasoline shortage and no way to get gasoline. Since 1926, they've been able to make it out of coal. As a matter of fact, the German war machine in World War II was run largely on gasoline that was extracted and produced from coal. Well, all right, so what did Standard Oil do about this? Why did I.G. Farben invite Standard Oil to see this? You think, my golly, they'd just keep that a big secret, wouldn't they? No, of course not. They don't want to compete. Their objective was not to go out in the field and compete with price or a better quality product. Their objective was to invite Standard Oil to join with them in a cartel agreement so they wouldn't have to compete. And so in order to come up with a good cartel agreement which would be beneficial to I.G. Farben, Farben had to show its strength, to give Standard Oil a peek at their cards so they would negotiate, and negotiate they did. Negotiations went on for 3 years. And at the end of that negotiation, Standard Oil and I.G. Farben were married. And I use that phrase, that word, married, because this is the word that Mr. Howard used to describe it. That describes the intensity of the cartel agreement that brought these two cartels together. The cartel agreement was signed on November 9, 1929, and it contained 3 basic provisions. 1, Standard Oil received 1/2 ownership of all of the rights to the hydrogenation process everywhere in the world except Germany. 2, in return, I.G. Farben received 456,000 shares of Standard Oil stock, which was valued in 1929 at over $30 million. You can imagine what its value would be today. And the third provision was that both parties agreed not to compete with each other evermore in their respective fields. In other words, they agreed that in the future, that if Standard Oil ever wished to go into the field of drugs or chemicals in general, it would do so jointly with I.G. Farben. And Farben agreed that if ever they wanted to go into the field of petroleum or petroleum products, byproducts, they would do so jointly with Standard Oil, so they wouldn't have to compete. And they have lived up to that agreement, ladies and gentlemen, through a war and right up to the very present. I'm going to digress even further now and tell you something which may come as a surprise. I know it came as one terrific surprise to me when I started digging into the records. I.G. Farben, which is a group I had never heard of until a few years ago, I.G. Farben was the dominant force behind Adolf Hitler. Farben created Hitler out of nothing. Farben picked Hitler out of the gutter, so to speak, financed him, promoted him, and pushed him, and made him the head of Germany. At the low point in Hitler's career, he was down and out. He had no followers. He had no money. It was a conscious decision made at the highest levels inside Farben to put untold amounts of money behind Adolf Hitler and make him Chancellor of Germany. And they did. It was just a matter of spending enough money to do so. And also putting pressure to bear on the newspapers inside Germany, which were beholden to I.G. Farben. And so the editorial tone of all of these newspapers suddenly changed overnight, and Hitler was lifted out of oblivion and became the leader. We must keep in mind, however, that Adolf Hitler was always nothing more or less than a puppet of I.G. Farben. It is interesting, for instance, to read the testimony of Mr. Ivy Lee. Ivy Lee was a man who was a public relations expert in New York City. He was the man who was hired by John D. Rockefeller to help improve Rockefeller's public image. Ivy Lee is the man that came up with the idea that every time Rockefeller went in public, he should always have a roll of nice, brand new, shiny dimes, which he can toss out to the kiddies, and the kiddies would scamper for the dimes, and the photographers would take the pictures, and his picture would be in every newspaper across the country, the kind of publicity you couldn't buy with money. And people would look at the picture of John D. giving a dime to some little kid, and they'd get the feeling that he was a kindly old philanthropist who loved children. And it worked. This was Ivy Lee's promotion. Ivy Lee was called to testify before the Senate, and he said that he had been invited to Germany by I.G. Farben. He was paid by I.G. Farben to interview Adolf Hitler and the other members of Hitler's staff to analyze their potential as leaders and to give suggestions of how they could best perform their leadership function. I.G. Farben was paying for leadership training for Hitler, Goebbels, and all the rest. The record is also very clear that it was the Farben enterprises that ran the concentration camps at Buchenwald, Auschwitz, Bitterfeld, and all the others. Did you ever wonder why those concentration camps were run? They were run for one purpose, and that was slave labor. Slave labor where? In the factories of I.G. Farben. Those camps were run to man the factories of I.G. Farben, and they were set up for that purpose. And all of this came out at the Nurenberg trials. Unfortunately, it was the men in the uniforms who were singled out as the war criminals. The men in the business suits who wore the ties and who ran Farben got off because they were just misled businessmen, overly zealous for a little profit. They knew what they were doing when they created puppets like Adolf Hitler to wear the uniforms and stand in front and take the hatred of the people. But they were the ones behind the scenes who were the real power. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we need to redefine a few terms. When I went to school, I was told that fascism is the corporate state. Well, it is. It is the corporate state, but which is dominant, the corporation or the state? I was taught that in Germany, for instance, the industrialists of Germany made a terrible mistake when they supported Adolf Hitler, because he came to power, and when he got that power, he turned around and he used the power of the state against industry to regulate and control industry. And see what a mistake that was for industrialists to do that. And wow, when you start digging into the facts, just the opposite was true. The industrialists created this puppet. They owned and controlled the state, and they used the police power of that state to enforce cartel agreements on everybody in the country and to prevent competition. The cartelists controlled the state. The state did not control the cartelists. Now, is there any resemblance between that little charade and what is happening in the United States today? All of the laws that are supposedly being passed on behalf of the people, going to protect the people from the corporate interests, the big business interests. You know, we need a fair trade law, don't we? We need a fair trade law to protect the people from what? A fair trade law is a law, as you know, which prevents the shopkeeper down here from lowering his prices. Now, who do you suppose passed that law? Who wanted that law passed? The people? No, that's a result of political pressure from the corporate interests behind the scenes that are getting these laws passed. And your politicians are puppets in many cases for cartelists and monopolists. Don't confuse this for a minute with free enterprise. Just because a man is in business doesn't mean he's a free enterpriser. As a matter of fact, most of your biggest businessmen today are socialists who lean heavily on government control and government intervention, such as fair trade laws, to protect their monopolies. They couldn't survive in a true competitive free market economy. Cartelists escape competition. Free enterprise is competition. Socialists do not want free enterprise. Therefore, cartelists and socialists get along just fine. Both of them are aimed at the destruction of the free enterprise system. And that is why you find that most of the big businessmen, most of the big cartelists are indeed socialists or collectivists. So we have to redefine a few terms. Fascism is not something that is dead and long gone, that lived for a brief period in Nazi Germany. And I mean this without any exaggeration. The spirit of Adolf Hitler is alive and well in the United States of America today. Now, as the Nazis prepared for war, they knew that there was going to be trouble in the United States because of their obvious German holdings. All those companies I mentioned to you before, they were commonly known as German holdings, all listed in the library and Standard & Poor's. You could read the list of the board of directors, and they all had German names. We went back to the old issues of Standard & Poor's and checked them all out. You can't pronounce half of them, at least I can't. And so as they prepared for war, they knew that something had to be done. Otherwise, the United States government undoubtedly would, as they did in World War I, step in and take over these companies because they were owned by aliens in time of war. And so they started to camouflage their holdings. They did this many ways through, first of all, Americanizing the names of the men who were on the board of directors. We got rid of all the names like Schmitz and replaced them with names like Walter Teagle, who was the president of Standard Oil, and Edsel Ford. And names like that began to show up on the board of directors of the major IG Farben companies. And then also they camouflaged it through a maze of corporate street names, names that are really fictitious names. They used fictitious stockholders, or what we call dummy stockholders, and numbered Swiss accounts, and all of this sort of thing, until finally the whole process culminated in what appeared to be, on the surface, a giant Swiss company, a holding company known as IG Chemie. Now, the Securities and Exchange Commission investigated this whole matter in 1938. And during this investigation, they invited Mr. Teagle, who, as I've said several times, is the president of Standard Oil, to the witness stand. And they asked him, by the way, Mr. Teagle was also on the board of directors of the American IG. All right. So they asked Mr. Teagle a few questions. Did he know who owned American IG, the company which he served on the board of directors? And his answer was, no, he didn't know. They said, well, Mr. Teagle, do you know how many shares of American IG are owned by IG Chemie in Switzerland? He didn't know that either. And they said, finally, well, Mr. Teagle, we notice here on the record that there are 500,000 shares, 500,000 shares of American IG that are issued in your name. Do you own those? He said, no. Oh, you don't own those shares? Well, then who does? He said, I don't know. Can you imagine the gall of a man saying, I don't know? Well, they couldn't force him to answer. It was later shown, though, in further investigations, that he did know exactly who owned those shares. It was proved that Mr. Teagle was acting as an agent of the Rockefeller interests, and he was holding those shares on behalf of the Rockefeller family. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason for my going into all of this background is simply this. If you were to go to Washington today and go to the Securities and Exchange Commission and get a list of all of the drug companies operating in the United States and start looking up a list of stockholders to find out who owns them, you will not find the name Rockefeller or Standard Oil or any of the obvious Rockefeller holdings. And you might conclude, therefore, that Rockefeller has nothing to do with the drug industry in America, and you would be wrong. It was a conscious plan dating right back to the original marriage contract between Farben and Standard Oil, that Rockefeller would be a dominant force in the field of drugs, but that he would stay in the background and keep it concealed. And this was especially important during time of war, when the Rockefeller interests had to pose as fiercely patriotic enterprises. If it were known then that he was, in fact, a substantial partner with German firms which were actively producing war goods to destroy American lives, it just wouldn't go over too well with the people at the gas pumps. And so it's been a brilliant job of camouflage, and it stays that way today. But the fact remains, when you dig into this history, that the Rockefeller interests are clearly the most dominant force in the field of the drug cartel in America today. Now, the mechanism for the link-up between the Rockefeller IG cartel, that link-up comes when we go back and examine the tax-exempt foundations. Now, these foundations were pioneered by Rockefeller and Carnegie for three purposes. One, to improve their public image, make them look like good guys giving away lots of money to worthy causes. Two, to preserve their vast family fortunes from inheritance taxes. Turn it over to a tax-exempt foundation completely controlled by the family, but technically not in their name. So as long as you can control your money and spend it in any way you wish, who cares whether it's technically in your name or not? Use is the important thing. And so it preserved their fortunes from inheritance tax when everybody else had to pay that inheritance tax. And thirdly, it was very, very useful for financing commercially or ideologically profitable ventures with tax-exempt dollars under the guise of philanthropy. Efficiency in philanthropy. Never give it away unless it's going to come back with another dollar with it. Now, the guy that masterminded this efficiency in philanthropy was an interesting person by the name of Reverend Fred Gates. I don't know how reverend he was. He sort of abandoned his ministerial profession very early in the game. He used it more or less as a cover to collect money. He was a great fundraiser in the early days. And he attracted the attention of George Pillsbury of the Pillsbury flour fame. Pillsbury had a similar problem to John D. Rockefeller. He had a bad reputation. And Fred Gates devised what is called the Pillsbury formula. So that, well, by the way, the Pillsbury formula in this sense is not a formula for flour, it's a formula for bread, if you know what I mean. Here's how they made the bread. See, Pillsbury was giving away money, which was all right. That improved his image. $1 million, he could well afford it. Get his name on the stonework of a new hospital or a school or a library. But Fred Gates said, look, George, this is stupid. Why give away $1 million? Here's what I propose. You give away $500,000. You put it up as what we will call it matching funds on the stipulation that the hospital or the school or whatever the object of your philanthropy is will go out and raise the other half. Get the community involved. There'll be a big fundraising drive. Your name will be attached to the fundraising drive. You will be the big hero. You put up half the money if only the rest of the people will come up with the other half. And so you'll get businessmen and housewives and everybody else around digging into their pockets and putting in their $1 and their $10 and their $100, and they identify with you, Mr. Pillsbury. And when it's all over, you still get your name on this piece of stone across the archway. You're still the hero, but it only cost you half as much money. And not only that, you've got all of these people in the community identifying with you and thinking you're such a great guy because you and they have both chipped in together. That's the Pillsbury formula. And old John D. Rockefeller saw that, and his eyes began to sparkle, and he invited Mr. Gates to his offices for consultation. And he hired him on the spot. He said, this is the man for me. And as a matter of fact, John D. Rockefeller himself, in writing about Fred Gates, had this to say, and I quote, Rockefeller said, I realized I had met a commercial genius. I persuaded Mr. Gates to become a man of business, end quote. And he did. He put Mr. Gates in charge of his philanthropy operations. And one of the first tax-exempt organizations created was called the General Education Board. And it was under the tutelage of Fred Gates. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of the General Education Board was not, as you might guess, to raise the level of education, but to use education to change society and to mold the attitudes of the unsuspecting public. Now, that may sound like a far-out statement, but consider this. The first publication of the General Education Board appeared in 1904, and in that, here is what Mr. Gates said, and I quote directly. In our dreams, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. the present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk." End quote. Now that's kind of an inside view into the thinking processes of these people who are putting up the money and altering the educational systems of this land for many, many years. Thank you very much.